Well, let's look at verse 1. Verse 1, we're going to establish that Joseph Smith that says this is from God, because he says, I verily, thus saith the Lord. Now that right there puts him on the category of being a prophet, and that means that when he says, thus saith the Lord, we have the right to judge him as a prophet. We have the right to test to find out if the Lord really would say something like this. And so he does stand up to looking into who he is at that point. But he talks here that he says, my servants, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and Solomon were practicing polygamy. Now, for those of you who have a Doctrine and Covenants, I would suggest you get out your book and you can follow through with this. If you don't have a Doctrine and Covenants, we're not going to put the verses on the screen. It's just too much because there are too many verses, too many words. But we will read as much to you as we can. But in the biblical record, as I go in and check the Bible and test all things to make sure they're true or not, Isaac didn't live polygamy.
Right.
Moses didn't live polygamy.
Right.
And so we have two falsehoods right there in the first verse. And it says that his servants touching the principle and doctrine of their having many wives and concubines, behold, I, the Lord, will answer you touching this matter. I agree with Mrs. Stenhouse. God had already spoken in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants and the Bible that he was against polygamy. Why was Joseph Smith asking
Why would he
about
be
it?
in crime? Well, yes, and one thing I didn't mention earlier, because of the affair with Fanny Alger, there were terrible rumors going around about Joseph having adulterous affairs and stuff like that. And so in 1835, the Mormon Church placed in their Doctrine and Covenants of that day a section on marriage. And in that marriage, it specifically said something to the effect, inasmuch as we've been accused of the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare one man should have one wife except in the case of death. And this section was in every edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, clear through Joseph's life, clear up through Utah until 1876. So if Joseph had come to you, like poor Emma, to try to talk you into polygamy, you would have been raised on a Doctrine and Covenants that said, we don't believe in polygamy.
Right.
And here's the prophet coming and saying, well, yeah, that's what it says in the public books, but God's revealed this other doctrine to me behind the scenes, which gets back to your point of testing the prophets. If we make the assumption, if God were going to set up polygamy, would he do it in this way? Would he do it in a way that causes Joseph to lie to his wife, lie to the church, and lie to the public? And I don't believe that's a mark of a prophet of God.
Right. And in fact, in Mrs. Stenhouse's book and others, they were over, the missionaries were over across the ocean to several countries, converting people and denying polygamy. And even the people that were denying it were living it themselves back here in Utah. So you're right. He would not introduce it that way. Verse 3, we have to give a disclaimer right here for all of you who are watching this program. You need to be aware, that when you hear about this, you are required to live it. You'll be damned if you don't. That's what it says in verse 3. Because when you hear this law, it's revealed to you and you don't live it, you're in trouble. So if you don't want to get in trouble with God because you don't practice polygamy, don't worry about that, because we've checked the Bible and the Bible doesn't say that you have to live polygamy. So I guess you're okay with that particular disclaimer. Let's go to verse 6, unless you have something before then that you'd like to look at.
No, it's just interesting that since we know this was written to be taken to Emma, who was opposing Joseph's polygamy, I mean, right off the bat, she's struck with these admonitions in the first few verses that if you reject this, you'll be damned. I mean, you see the control factor. To me, it's a control factor to intimidate Emma into accepting it.
It is, and when you get to verse 6, that's exactly what happens, because in verse 6 it says you'll be damned if you don't live it. And that's what happened to us in the polygamy groups, and they do that. The polygamy groups will do the same thing to intimidate, especially the girls as they're growing up, that if you don't practice this, you will be damned. And we heard the story of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth and outer darkness and pain for eternity if we didn't succumb to and submit to the practice of living polygamy. In verse 6, it talks about this being a new and everlasting covenant. And I have a question about that, because we have the Old Testament, which is the Old Covenant. We have the New Testament, which is the New Covenant, and Hebrews 8 tells us that the Old Testament is fading away because the New Testament, which is salvation by grace through the death of Jesus Christ on the cross, is taking its place, and it's the priority now. And now Joseph Smith, 1800 years later, brings in a new covenant.
Right.
Polygamy replaces Jesus' death on the cross. Basically, I mean, maybe a lot of people don't understand that that's what it's doing, but that is what it's doing. And then what does the word everlasting mean?
Right. Well, you see this all through this Revelation, where he is taking Bible verses, Bible concepts, and recasting them all to make it apply to polygamy, when the different verses he tries to pull in have nothing to do with polygamy, like the New and Everlasting Covenant has nothing to do with polygamy, and yet that's how he redefines doctrine as he goes through. He'll use Bible phrases,
yes,
but put a whole new meaning to them.
Yes, that's exactly right. It does say in verse 6, though, something that bothers me. It says that God is supposedly talking, and it said that polygamy, or this new and everlasting covenant, was instituted for the fullness of my glory. In other words, God's glory is dependent on whether all of these, half of God's creation lives in misery and pain and rejection and loneliness and neglect and suffering through polygamy, the women. His glory is based on the sufferings of women?
Well, it would also imply that God is living in a polygamous situation.
That's
if
what
his
they believe.
Glory is dependent on this.
Absolutely. And I find that rather disturbing. Do you have anything before we get to verse, I think it's 20, no.
Well, I think in verse 7 is where they talk about that any one that's entered into a marriage relationship before this time, if it wasn't through the power of the priesthood, it's of no efficacy. And this is an important thing in Mormon theology and in the polygamous theology, that regular marriage ceremonies don't count in the eyes of God. And I believe one of the reasons he's bringing this in is it gives a rationalization for him taking these different women, especially like the women that already had other husbands. If all marriages are null and void and don't count in God's sight, then maybe those women would be available that already have a husband, because they aren't married according to the law of God.
Right, but they're still living with their husbands.
Well, small detail.
A small detail, right. Well, we have an off-the-air question here. Francis from Ogden asks, why are African Americans not treated well in LDS Church? How did they get the name Mormons? I'd like to mention to our viewing audience right now that we do appreciate all of your phone calls and questions, but please would you keep it on the subject matter for the night. We are going to open up the phone lines now if you want to start calling in, but please keep it to a minimum of 2 questions, and if you have comments, please keep it to 1 minute. Turn your television down when you get on the air, please, because that just wastes time, and if it is too much time to get that fixed, we will go to the next caller. So, Francis, if you would call in some other day when we're talking about this particular part, we will be happy to answer your question, but right now we're talking about Section 132. Viewers, please call in and focus your question on our subject matter or with our guest, Sandra Tanner. Okay, I really don't have much to say about verses 18 and 19, except verse 18 is 1 sentence.
Oh, yes, it's very long.
134 words. Verse 19 is worse. It's 1 sentence, and it has 214 words. Joseph Smith really didn't know how to end his sentences.
Well, I think 19, right. I think 19 is important, because this is where you get this concept that if you're married in the New and Everlasting Covenant, you can commit any sin short of murder and still have your exaltation and become a god, and go on with what they call the continuation of the seeds forever.
Right.
And I think this was another thing that was important on Joseph's mind, because from my point of view, I think he had committed adultery even by Mormon definition. And this is a rationalization of why he should be forgiven for whatever has happened before, because he didn't commit murder. So if he doesn't do that, he can be forgiven of anything. And I think it's a very odd concept that every sin will be forgiven as long as you don't do murder. If you're married in the true priesthood session.
And also on the continuation of seeds forever that it says here, that's eternal childbearing for us women. That's not a very good definition for heaven.